Olá, é um grande prazer estar aqui novamente para mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples, da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Hoje vamos falar sobre a migração climática. Numa altura em que os desastres naturais se multiplicam, cada vez mais as populações fogem deles, e é um tema muito importante numa altura em que o planeta continua a sofrer inundações, incêndios e muitos outros desastres também. Vamos ter a oportunidade de falar com um dos jornalistas mais conceituados que segue este tema, que se chama Abrahm Lustgarten, conceituado jornalista norte-americano, nomeado para vários prémios, incluindo um Pulitzer em 2016, e que se dedica precisamente às migrações climáticas. Vamos arrancar com esta conversa com o Abrahm, que se junta ao programa. Abrahm, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and this is such an important topic to be discussing off the back of a summer that was truly chaotic when it comes to natural disasters. Let's set the scene, and you've talked about the 3 C's which make populations migrate: cash, conflict, or climate. When it comes to climate, what's the landscape right now, and how many people are moving?
Yeah, so those factors you just mentioned, they combine subtly, and it's some sort of concoction that ultimately, pushes people to move. And what we're seeing is that, these climate pressures, that whether it's the heat or the failure of crops or the lack of water in places, are growing as one of those factors. So it's like a subtle indicator that's increasingly pushing, more people to move. And so you're seeing that pressure in parts of North Africa now. We've seen the signature of climate on tensions in places like Syria, and here in the United States, North America, we're seeing it in South America and Central America, where extreme drought is driving crop failures that are driving food shortages that are ultimately responsible for some of the migration that's coming towards the U.S. border. So you're starting to see this motion now, as well as displacement from some of the big storms and the disasters that we've had, which is another kind of propulsion into migration.
Just so our audience has a more precise idea of the numbers we're talking about here, I've seen different numbers reported by different organizations. How big is this problem right now, and how much bigger will it become in decades to come?
Yeah, it's difficult to measure. The United Nations points to something like 250 million displaced people around the world right now, but it's likely that if you were to include people displaced by climate factors in some subtle way, that number would be much larger. But what we see going into the future, what the scientists are modeling and what they predict is a phenomenon far larger. There's a study that I like to reference that looks at the parts of the planet that have traditionally been kind of considered uninhabitable for the last 6,000 years or so, and estimates that about 1% of the planet is difficult to live in. But by 2070, just 50 years from now, it estimates that about 20% of the planet will be, unlivable. And that means that, up to 2.5 to 3 billion people will be affected by, climate pressures that could force them to move.
There's so many effects of climate migration, and I wanted to get into some of those. As far as the quality of life that we see in the areas where people are migrating to, what have you noticed as far as the larger impact that these areas have suffered from the increase of other populations?
It's the people moving are often, they're just looking to improve their lives. So they're attracted by economic opportunity, or they're forced out by, the kind of perils that we're talking about, starvation or just, subtler pressures. And they're just looking for an opportunity to work, an opportunity to integrate into a new community and build a better life in most cases. And in some places that receive those migrants, they're welcomed with open arms. There's often the intent, the goodwill to begin that way. But almost always, when you look at sort of the modeled patterns of what happens with mass migrations around the world, there's also a tension. That influx of new people, just the sheer numbers, the growth that goes with it, the cultural frictions that arise from it. Sometimes it's overt racism, but sometimes it's just just the clashing of different groups of people, it almost always leads to some kind of tension. And so, one of the big questions I think for the future is how that tension manifests. But, you see that in Europe, what happened in Germany in 2015 is a prime example of the intent to accept large numbers of migrants out of Syria and to welcome those people. But even within Germany, that leading to a bit of a political backlash, and certainly across the rest of the continent, an even greater friction and backlash in the years that followed.
And do you think that the situation in Italy as well could be, with a far-right government being voted in, that could also be as a result of the increase in migrants in Italy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Italy's been literally on the front lines of the migratory movement out of North Africa for a while, and we've seen incremental resistance to that over the last couple of years, with the movement of migrants into camps, the harsh treatment of those migrants in camps, and now the movement towards the extreme right in the recent election absolutely seem to be a reflection in part of the pressures of migration. And there's a strong argument that Britain's exit from the European Union is also influenced by that sort of xenophobic resistance to more migrants coming to Britain, as was happening in the years before Brexit.
I think when it comes to climate, this summer has been quite dramatic in the examples that we've seen, from wildfires to flooding to hurricanes. Does it even make sense anymore that there are, whether it's politicians, leaders, influencers who are questioning climate change and how drastic the situation is getting? Do you think that in a way the planet needed to see this kind of impact this summer to take this situation even more seriously?
No, it doesn't make sense that there's any, resistance to the idea of climate change anymore. I mean, the science is resoundingly clear. It is virtually unanimous over many decades of research. It is clear that the man-made emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are causing, the Earth to warm in a way that hasn't happened historically in a very, very long time, and is far different from other warming periods throughout history. And that is driving the intensity of so many of these events that we see. Should people have waited to see the disastrous effects that they were warned about decades ago? I mean, I think that this is a very difficult cultural shift, and it's a difficult problem to wrap your mind around. And it's unfortunate that it's taken like the last 2 years, 3 years of intense disasters to wake so many people up to what is happening. But that's also, it's a ball that started rolling a long time ago. So in a way, better late than never, that there's a greater public realization of the consequences. But a lot of those things, a lot of the climate change that has been set in motion, is already well underway. And, the public's a little late to that realization, unfortunately.
We'll look at what the future may hold later during our conversation. But here on this program, we like to break down certain important but somewhat complex topics. And obviously, when it comes to climate migrations, it is still a topic that is not as, let's say, mainstream as it could be. So how would you break it down for our audience, and why is it not that simple to understand what is happening or why it has happened?
I think what's most important to understand about, the idea of climate migration is that it's very difficult, if not, inappropriate, to try to attribute one factor like climate change to driving, population movement. And it really needs to be appreciated for the nuance that it is. It's often a tipping point, or, that proverbial straw that, that broke the back of an otherwise, tenuous situation. So in Syria, for example, the research says that, drought contributed to the difficulty of farmers keeping their cattle alive, which is part of what drove them, into urbanized areas, which is part of what, fueled, the resistance and uprising there. So, in that way, the Syrian migrants who came to Europe weren't explicitly climate migrants, but climate was a significant factor in, in what destabilized the region in the first place. And I think that's kind of how we have to see climate change. It's going to be an exacerbating factor. It's, the U.S., the Central Intelligence Agency here likes to call it a threat amplifier. And that's how it will affect migration. It will make it'll make difficult situations worse. It'll make them more difficult, and it will drive people to that final decision point of finding that they have to try to seek a new life in a new place.
You mentioned the United States, and I'd like to get into different areas of the world, geographical areas, and how the leaders there are dealing with this issue. When it comes to the U.S., what's crazy for me, and we know that the landscape is becoming increasingly polarized, and it seems also increasingly clear that this is an issue that the Democrats are taking seriously, but still not really on the Republican agenda. How is that possible, and how have you seen this political dynamic in the States developing when it comes to climate change, and therefore climate migration?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost inexplicable, and it's tragic, to be honest, because this is a universal threat that really doesn't care what political party or what beliefs its victims hold, and it's something that we've known about and understood well for many decades now. I think what you see playing out in the political process in the United States, which isn't entirely different from elsewhere, is not so much about disbelief over the science of climate change, but tension over what it implies needs to change. And, what climate change suggests are changes in our collective lifestyle, in the way, modern life is lived, that are antithetical to the way that, for example, big corporations make money, in particular the fossil fuel industry, but not just the fossil fuel industry. I mean, really just like our habits of consumption, the creature comforts that, all of us in the developed, wealthy world enjoy, need to be moderated and checked. And so from a political standpoint, if you're a leader crafting policy on this issue, I mean, that's kind of the trade-off. None of these, there's no easy way to cut carbon emissions or to legislate that. It all comes with a hit to powerful interests. And in the United States, unfortunately, those interests hold great sway in our political system. They lobby extensively. They spend an enormous amount of money. A lot of our representatives, and not just Republicans, Democrats too, are it's strong to say beholden, but some of them are, and some of them are more subtly influenced. But that influence is there, and it has slowed down progress and action across the board for a generation.
How much impact can public discord have in the States when it comes to protests, when it comes to the masses voicing their concern and their displeasure at the climate change topic not being taken seriously by the politicians?
Yeah, I mean, like anywhere, discord can have enormous influence. It just depends on the scale of the discord. I mean, do you have a mass collective voice that speaks all at once, or do you have sporadic, smaller protests that are a lot less persuasive? And and does that protest cross political boundaries, or is it all coming from one side of the spectrum? I think those are what really determine how effective it is. But I also think that especially in the United States and in Europe, the public votes with its pocketbook in a way. So that same difficult transition, or accepting the consequences, the implications of climate change, which among other things mean that we should use less and consume less. That means that, every household, every person needs to adjust, their lifestyle and their own habits. And it doesn't mean that we all need to sort of, be ascetic and voluntarily descend into poverty or anything like that. But there are changes that, we're all resistant to make, and Americans are resistant to make. And, I think that a form of protest or a form of demonstration of the willingness to act on climate, starts a little bit with individual people changing their habits.
Here in Europe, I mean, I certainly hear a lot of coverage of renewable energy and solutions for the fossil fuel pollution model. Let's look at the different superpowers and how seriously they're taking this. We've talked a little bit about the States, but obviously we need to talk about China and we need to talk about India. What's going on there from your perspective, and how far behind are they in both recognizing a need to change and wanting to change?
It's such an interesting question because obviously those two countries determine the fate of the world in terms of climate change in many ways. They are both ahead and behind the curve at the same time. China especially is such an interesting example. What both of these countries want is for their enormous populations to have the opportunity to achieve the same standard of living that we enjoy in Europe and the United States. And that's a reasonable desire. Almost from a human rights perspective, it's easy to think that they're entitled to that ambition. Somehow that needs to happen for them in a way different from how it happened for us, which is, through industrialization, through a century of burning fossil fuels to get there. I think India has a particularly long way to go in sorting that out. But China, is pursuing the kind of growth and, an improvement in its economy that it wants at the same time that it is very quickly expanding reliance on renewable power, reliance on nuclear power, the use of electric vehicles, for example. Emissions continue to grow, and coal, unfortunately, continues to be used in larger numbers in China. And that's a transition that they'll need to move away from that quickly. But you also see the fastest growth in the world in the adoption of renewable energy in China. And I think that's going to be, the model for India as well. Part of their success is going to hinge on, I think, on some international cooperation, perhaps, international funding or economic support for making that transition to new technologies and cleaner energy happen as quickly as possible.
The war in Europe obviously had a big impact on the energy supply and demand, not only on our continent here, but around the world. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about climate wars as well, and the role of energy in them. Do you think that this war has accelerated the awareness that there needs to be an increase in the transition towards a more responsible way of consuming energy itself, and in looking for alternative clean energy solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. In many ways, this is an energy war because Europe's reliance on fossil fuels, on natural gas from Russia in particular, has become so apparent and is such an explicit part of the tensions. So obviously, it has drawn people to see the potential opportunity in not having that reliance. And I think everybody wishes that there was, a full supply of renewable energy, clean energy, readily available, not being throttled by a foreign power. And that is the opportunity that an energy transition that benefits climate change, would present. Unfortunately, that transition hasn't happened yet, or isn't completed yet. And so, it's, the energy crunch hits pragmatically at a very difficult time, and and the challenges are extremely real. So it's not as if we can just sort of blithely say we should only use clean energy immediately right now, and that's a solution, because that there's not enough power and enough energy with current installations of for example wind and solar power to do that. So we're in a weird sort of crunch period of the war happening at the same time we're in a transition, and that's kind of swirling together with ambitions around climate change, but also just the real pragmatic need to supply basic energy needs.
Earlier in our conversation, you said that in 50 years we could have up to 20% of the planet uninhabitable, or at least have extreme conditions that would make human life very difficult to deal with. What are those areas, and how seriously are people taking this timeline? Because, I mean, 50 years is absolutely nothing, right?
Yeah, I mean, 50 years is a blink of the eye.
Yeah.
It's the equatorial regions of the planet, no big surprise that, will face the harshest changes soonest. So, the World Bank has done extensive study of these potential migration hotspots related to climate change. And the hotspots that they identify, are, the Sahel region of North Africa, home to 100 million people, Central America, the northern part of South America, and South Asia, across South Asia, one of the most populated parts of the planet. So northern India, Thailand, throughout, Pakistan. These are the most vulnerable spots, and likely to be those kind of hot spots for displacement of populations, over the next 50 years.
When it comes to what we as a race need for a wake-up call, and we've talked about what happened this summer, but in the United States, do you think that the recent phenomenon of Hurricane Ian and the impact it had there also helped the narrative in a way?
One can hope. It's difficult to say and too early to tell. And we've had a lot of disasters in the United States over the last couple of years that, pundits or climate advocates have talked about as turning points and wake-up calls, whether that's Hurricane Harvey in Houston and, or Hurricane Ian now in Florida. Florida is an interesting case because, it has very conservative leadership, and its governor, is, resistant to the idea of climate change and resistant to action to confront climate change. And I'll be waiting to see, what he does, in the months that come. But from a larger perspective, yes, every single disaster, and this is unfolding to be a terrible one, is going to collectively make people incrementally more aware of the threats of climate change. And I think in some subtle way, it will continue to push people towards taking some responsible action towards it.
I did want to play devil's advocate, and let's say, which is not the case, that I contest climate change, and I just tell you, Abrahm, you know what? This has happened throughout history. We've had periods where the Earth gets warmer. We've had periods where there has been severe weather and severe natural disasters. And you know what? The planet was just fine. It recovered, and it kept going, and it stabilized. I mean, what do you tell people who have this argument?
Just because there's been periods of warming or blips in the data historically doesn't mean that all of those blips are of the same scale or are actually analogous to what's happening now. And if you look at the data now, the warming and the correlating levels of carbon dioxide are stratospherically higher than anything they've ever been, before. And I'm not a scientist. I report on what the scientists say, but there is no controversy in the scientific community. I know there are people that that say what you said, but they're really outliers, and they're really a minuscule minority. And the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the global authority and issues its report every couple of years on the state of warming and the climate. I consider those reports conservative because they're a consensus view of hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists around the world. So they really give you kind of the minimum perspective of how severe this challenge is and how much of an outlier it is, historically, in global history. And those reports have reached such a resounding consensus. 99.9 something percent, of their viewpoints are entirely consistent. I think the debate about whether this is a real problem, whether the science supports it, I think for the vast majority of the planet, that's a conversation of the past.
Okay, so right now in 2022, and obviously you've been writing about this subject for several years, what should we be focusing on, and what are you focusing on the reporting you do, and what area of climate migration should we be focusing on? Is it about the problems that are there, or the solutions that need to be implemented, or who should be working on those solutions?
Yeah, it's both. It's all at the same time. I mean, we're entering an era where, right, it's kind of overwhelming. I mean, we're entering an era where we still need to plan and mitigate is the technical term that they use for the future, and slow down the rate of warming by cutting emissions. And at the same time, the effects of climate change are well underway, and so we need to adapt to those effects. The ball has started to roll, and it can't be stopped. It can be slowed. And with that comes migration. And, so these are a lot of different types of challenges. But, to take migration, it's going to start to happen. The scale of it is what remains to be determined. And, I think that an awareness of what historically have been the pitfalls of dealing with that challenge will just help smooth, the opportunities for the future. Unfortunately, it will in certain places lead to conflict and tension, but I think the greater awareness about the potential for that conflict makes it easier to avoid those in certain places. But we need the world needs, not just the United States, quick policy to cut emissions, quick planning to strengthen our infrastructure, strengthen our countries, strengthen our coastlines against storms that can reduce some of that displacement and reduce the impact of some of these like horrible storms like Hurricane Ian or the heat waves that are impacting China these last couple of months. We need all of that. We needed it yesterday. It has to happen at the same time.
I think the message there is really clear. I wanted to finish off our interview with a series of quick-fire questions that we ask all our guests to have a macro look at what your perspective is when it comes to the most important topics that the planet should be focusing on. So the first one is, what is one personality trait that a good leader could benefit from having?
Yeah, I mean, I think strong convictions and independence from outside influence. I think that the greatest vulnerability is a leader who's steered and torn by the enormous pressures on their decision making, and we need leaders who know what is right and have the courage to do what they believe is right.
Which is easier said than done many times. What is the biggest challenge that humanity faces today?
I mean, the heat and drought and the increasing frequency of extreme storms and extreme events will drive all sorts of global change. They'll drive discomfort and displacement directly related to those events, but they'll also drive a movement of people that's going to lead to increasing conflict and dramatic economic change as well. And those various threats need to be seen as the sort of collective challenge that they are. They all fall under this umbrella of climate-induced change.
If you could change one thing in the world by magic, what would that be?
I think it would be to instantaneously have a situation where we could cut our global emissions to zero. Achieve that carbon dioxide emissions reduction that the world needs to make. If we had all the renewable energy, all the solar and wind power that we needed, and that could happen overnight, that will slow this transition. The ball of climate change has already started to roll, but the faster those emissions fall, the slower it will roll, and the shorter the distance it will go. And so, if we have any hope in the future of reducing the impacts, if we don't like the kind of events that we've seen recently around the world, and we want those events to happen less frequently, or at least not to get worse, we need to, cut those emissions overnight. And that would be my dream, is that somehow we could, flip a switch and those emissions would shut off.
And finally, what is the most important learning of your career so far?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, as I've come to wrap my head around, this issue of climate change. I've been an environmental reporter for 20 something years, and, wrapping my head around climate change, has been a real awakening for me. And so first there was the science, but then more recently it's been really the consideration about what climate change means for human lives, and to think about, how it changes the way we live, what people on this planet aspire to? What's the opportunity that living people on the planet have before them? And when you look at the climate science in the context of those challenges and changes, it's a mind-bending awakening to the kind of transition that we're in the midst of.
Abrahm Lustgarten, it was a pleasure to have you on our show, and I think you were very clear regarding the issues around climate change, the impact that it's having with migration, and some of the solutions that really the governments of the most impactful countries should be looking at right now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Foi um prazer e um privilégio ter a oportunidade de falar com o Abrahm, que nos explicou por que razão este tema da migração climática não ser assim tão simples. Até breve.